This is part 2 of the Empires is Nothing study. And just think about, here's another thing. By the end of the Roman Empire, there was other empires that rose up throughout the world. And basically, if you think about it, throughout the Bible times, ancient times, there was empires, the big main empires that you know of that were real powerful were all concentrated in the Middle Eastern area. But near the end of the what we call ancient times, when it was getting closer to Christ's birth, empires started to rise out of the Middle East. You know, first with Greece and then with Rome. And by the time the Roman Empire fell, there was empires that rose up all over the world. There was already some there. There was already some what you would call an empire around, but you just never heard much about them. But the power really shifted from the Middle East and went to other parts of the world, and especially went to Europe. There was empires that rose up through China, based at the Far East, Mongolia, that's both of them Far East. South America, you know about the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Incans. They were in a way an empire. They didn't last just very, very long, but they were empires. And then Europe. The European powers, though, were the most powerful, if you think about it, of the post-Roman world. And here's a few of them. Here's the Dutch Empire. You got the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, and the French Empire. That's some. There, and you know there's more. You got the British, and then you got the German, and you got the Belgian, and just basically about every European nation of that time all had some of an empire, even though they weren't all as large. At one time, the Spanish and the Portuguese were some of the most powerful nations in the world. At one time, they controlled a large empire. Later on, though, the British took them over. Didn't take over Spain, but overtook them and become the dominant power. All the European imperial powers took over lands throughout the world, but they really didn't pick up. They were powerful even throughout the Middle Ages and after the Roman Empire. They gained some power, but they didn't really start imperializing until the last part of the Dark Ages, through the Renaissance, and eventually all the way up into the 20th century. They were imperializing, and they owned land all the way from Asia to North and South America, Africa. And basically, at these empires' height, the only government, and only country that would ever even challenge them would be another European power. Most of the other nations around couldn't even challenge them. They would have defeated them with no problem. Other empires like that during the post-Roman world were the Mayans, Aztecs, Incans. You know, they were in Central South America, and then then in Asia, China become a pretty powerful nation themselves, but you never really see them imperializing much. Basically what they did was they unified what is now China, and that's kind of an empire themselves. That entire country is an empire almost, just because of how large it is. You got other nations that are about no really that big, and yet they own a lot, and then they have to go out to other lands and conquer if they want to build up. But China's a real big country. The largest one in Asia was the Mongolian Empire, which some of y'all, if y'all ever studied, know about them. They took an empire all the way from the Pacific Ocean to eastern Poland. They were a large empire of their time. Their empire didn't last. It lasted probably about 150 years before it collapsed. It didn't last no super long time, but that's pretty long. They just, but as they went on, they just started to, like with all empires, they just started to slowly fall and lose power. And then there's the Russian Empire. They were an empire that lasted for several hundred years, but they never really done much except fight off Napoleon in the 19th century with their harsh winter. Other empires in Europe is the Danish Empire, or Denmark, the Italian Empire, the Australian Empire. They're not European, but they're not part of Europe, but they're European descended. The Belgian Empire. And basically the European powers, if you look at it, if you got them all at once and looked at what they owned, basically the entire world was controlled by Europe. So basically most of them held pretty decent sized empires. Some of them didn't have a large empire. Then there was some, though, like the British and the French and the Spanish, that had large empires. Theirs were huge. They had a lot. Basically, at one time, the Europeans had tons of land. They basically, the entire world was Europe. They had about every little thing, about everything you could think of in the world. One of the European powers had it. It was almost think by the time Germany showed up as an empire, but when they unified in 1871, by the time they showed up and got into the imperializing, there was really no ground left to take. They didn't have nothing to go for. They only took a few countries. They took about 3 or 4 countries in Africa and then took a bunch of islands. And islands and little areas out in the Pacific. That was about all they could go for, because most everything else had been taken already by that time. They come so late in the imperializing. And then another empire was the Japanese Empire, this is real recent. This is about 70, 80 years ago, back in World War II. And they took a lot of land from Asia and from Britain. If you know about it, in World War II, they took a lot of those islands. They took parts of land from China, and they took Korea, and a lot of the islands and area in the Pacific were owned by the British Empire, and they attacked them and took it over. And then another empire was the Ottoman Empire. If any of you know history, you'll know all these empires, most of them. And the Ottoman Empire, some people call it the Turkish Empire, because the center was Turkey. Their capital was Constantinople, but some people have they absorbed them. Really, is, if you think about it, they were a continuum of the Roman Empire, because when the Roman Empire fell, later on they split into the Eastern and Western Roman Empire. Western was centered in Rome and parts mostly in Europe. The Eastern was in mostly Turkey, and their capital was Constantinople. The Western fell in sometime around 400 something, in the 400 AD range, somewhere in there. In 400 and something AD, the Eastern Roman Empire continued, and another name for it is the Byzantine Empire. They lasted all the way up until the 1100s before they collapsed, and they were conquered later and absorbed into the Ottoman Empire. So some people could say that the Ottoman Empire was, in fact, what you could say they're a continuum of the Roman Empire. And they controlled most all of the Middle East for about 600 years. At their height, they owned land in parts of southeastern Europe, Middle East, and North Africa at their height. And some other empires in our modern times that you might know about is, again, the British Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Soviet Union, German Empire, Nazi Germany, and the United States. And then the present-day European Union, which I'm going to tell you, they are the revived Roman Empire. They are. That's it right there. They haven't set up the beast system yet, but they will later. After the rapture, they will. They ain't done it yet, but everybody in the background, this being planned for. But again, think about it. These empires are nothing. All of them, all the ones I've named, are nothing compared to Christ. Christ's kingdom will not fail. Every one of these empires I just mentioned are not one of them are standing, except the United States, and we're falling ourselves. The United States is falling. We're eventually going to be nothing ourselves. We never were anything. We're just another powerful nation that God rose up, but at God's pleasure, He could strike us and destroy us at His pleasure. All these other nations were destroyed. Some of them didn't last very long. Nazi Germany only lasted 12 years. Soviet Union only lasted about 70, something like that. 1923 to 1991. They didn't last no super long time. There's empires that have lasted for hundreds of years before they fell. British Empire lasted 500 years. Imperial Germany only lasted 47 years. The Austro-Hungarian Empire lasted about, I don't know how many exactly, I can't think of the actual number, but they lasted about, I don't think they lasted 100 years themselves. And they weren't really that powerful. These empires, again, all the empires that have ever stood on earth, no matter how powerful, how big and bad they think they are nothing in God's eyes. They never last. None of them have lasted for 1,000 years. None of them have lasted. There may be a few that say they last 1,000 years, but they're not dominant. Especially they're not dominant that long. None of them have ever been dominant that many years. There's been probably a few that have lasted that long, but have they? But God's kingdom, the Christ kingdom, the millennial reign, it says it will have no end. These empires don't have no end. They have all ended. None of them have lasted. The empires are like a vapor that appears for a short time and vanisheth away. That's what God says about a man. He says you're like a vapor that appears for a short time and vanisheth away. I'd say empires the same way. You think all these empires at one time all thought they were untouchable, and that no nation or group of people could touch them. And they thought that they could not be defeated by anybody. They just run into any nation and fight them, and thought they were on top of the world. But God brought them down when He was ready.